Hello, guys. I want to welcome you to another session with Vladimir Ortiz, Bible Truth and Times. And this time we are going to go into a controversial topic. It's probably going to be one of the most intense and in-depth studies that we're going to do. Because the sessions that I do are usually 30 minutes. I am pretty sure that I will not finish. So this is going to be part one. And does God's law still stand? Does God's law still stand? Because of the time and how fast I'm going to be going, what I'm going to suggest to go ahead and get a pencil, a pen, and paper, and let's study the Bible. We're going to look up, we're going to mention a lot of verses. So I encourage you to look this up. Okay, this I'm not going to just pick this stuff out of the air. I am going to bring Bible truth. Okay, so I wanted to read from Romans 2:21 through 24. And it says, "You therefore who teach another, do you teach yourself? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? You who say, do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written." Today, we are seeing everywhere, everywhere, where mainstream Christians want to bring the law of God back to the people, which is interesting because for some things, they'll say, no, the law is abolished, that we are no longer under the law. Yet we are seeing that Christians saying we need to get back to God's law and remember the Ten Commandments. And they're posting the Ten Commandments as we find them in Exodus chapter 20. We know that the Ten Commandments include the Sabbath. But when it comes to the Sabbath, people will say, well, the law is abolished. And we're going to keep reading. We're going to find what the Bible says about this whole, matter. And in Ephesians 2:8 and 9, it says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourself. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast." So we Seventh-day Adventists believe that we are saved by God's grace and only through Christ's blood. Okay? So we are many times attacked by saying we are legalistic because we believe that the Ten Commandments still stand, including the Sabbath, the seventh day Sabbath. Yet, it's the same issue that mainstream Christians are trying to bring to the schools, to government buildings, to everywhere, that we should get back to God's law. So, like in Romans, we said, are we confusing people? And instead of bringing them to Christ, are we confusing them and pushing them away? Because we will say, yes, it is, and then no, it isn't when it comes to obeying God's law. Colossians 2:14, where it says that it's wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us and nailed it to the cross. So, what does that mean? Does that mean that God's law was truly nailed to the cross? The Ten Commandments? And and if it was, then why it would be free reign, right? Then it doesn't matter if we kill, it doesn't matter if we steal, if we commit adultery, if we blaspheme God's name, if we worship other idols. But see, when I mention all these, I am sure that most Christians will say, no, heaven forbid. Um, but the Sabbath, no, that's the old covenant. What are we talking about? And I do believe that most Christians are just confused about what the Bible says. Are the Ten Commandments really nailed to the cross? Luke 18:20, when he's talking to the young rich ruler, Jesus names several of the commandments. Said, "Are you keeping the commandments?" And he himself, said that he was, right. So Jesus would not have brought that up if they would have been abolished. And he himself said that he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill. Now, is fulfilling abolishing? Because he just said, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill. So, fulfill, does fulfilling the law or the commandments, does that mean that to do away with them? Well, I don't think that that's what that means. In John 14:21, he who keeps my commandments loves me. And I'm just paraphrasing what's said there. I have many, many verses. If we were to read all of them, we would take even longer. So John 14:21 brings us back that if we love our God, if we love Christ, then we will keep his commandments. In Revelation 22:14, blessed are those who keep his commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life. So, in the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, it reminds us, brings us back to the commandments of God. And it says that blessed are those who keep them, because they will have access to the tree of life. And Revelation 12:17, his people at the end of times are known because they keep the commandments of God. 1 John 5:2 and 3. This is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. So I think it is safe to say that the commandments definitely have a place in God's world, in the life of a Christian, or it should be. They should be. Did God make a mistake? Did God make a mistake when he gave the Ten Commandments? He says, oh, well, I made a mistake with this one. All the other ones are good, but not the fourth commandment is not good. Or did he say the 10th commandment is not good? I think I had made a challenge for anyone to name two commandments that we are no longer supposed to keep. And I haven't heard from anyone, but I guarantee you that that's because no one will be able to name two of the Ten Commandments. It's the only commandment that people seem to have a problem with is the Sabbath, the seventh day Sabbath. I have something here that I wanted to read from. Let me see if I can find it. Oh my goodness! It was Yes, I found it. Sorry. Ted Koppel, a very well-known journalist, and this was in declaration, or he was talking to Duke University, and he says, "We have actually convinced ourselves that slogans will save us. Shoot up if you must, but use a clean needle. Enjoy sex whenever with whomever you wish, but wear a condom. No, the answer is no. Not to not no because it isn't cool or smart or because you might end up in jail or dying in an AIDS ward, but no, because it's wrong. What Moses brought down from Mount Sinai were not the 10 suggestions, they were 10 commandments. Are not are not where the sheer brilliance of the 10 commandments is that they codify in a handful of words acceptable human behavior, not just for then or now, but for all time. Now, that's actually a pretty brilliant, I would say, speech. In short words, I think Ted Koppel said what many of us actually believe, or Christians should believe. The Ten Commandments was made for eternity, forever. Yet mainstream Christians have this tendency to say that they were nailed at the cross. Well, something definitely was nailed at the cross, but there is a lot of confusion as to what. When sin enters the world, we became rightfully Satan's. Do we Could we say that? Um, you know, let's actually, we should have looked up first Genesis 3, verse 15. Chapter 3, verse 15. A very well known verse. And we have to look at phrases and specific words because we're going to look at verse with verse what the Bible brings us and how each of them are connected to each other. And he says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." So when sin came, Adam sinned, Eve, and then the rest of their offspring. It says that at that time, instead of God's, we became Satan's. And if you don't believe that, we can read Romans 5, verse 12. It says, "Through one man sin entered the world, death spread to all men." So we Satan basically became the prince of this world, but God had a plan. God stepped in and made a promise, and this is that promise, that He will put enmity between Satan's seed and the woman's seed. And what is that? What is enmity? Well, enmity is a division, a separation, a partition set by God. God puts a desire of His people to separate from Satan. Okay, James 4:4, and we'll go really quick and read that. Um, Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. So Romans 3:23, it says, "All have sinned and come short to the glory of God." We are all the devil's seed before Christ rescues us. How many of us were born loving Christ? How many of us were born sinners? I was, and like Paul says, I'm of all the sinners, the worst, right? The number one. So Christ made a promise that he was going to rescue us. And the first act of redemption was the shedding of blood when God made tunics for Adam and Eve. That's found in Genesis 3:21. Now, I want to read a few verses from Leviticus 20 and then First Kings. So let's go to Leviticus 20, verse 24. And it says, "But I have said to you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has separated you from the peoples." Again, we're going to look at similar phrases, words that connect, that help us understand what we're coming to. Okay, what we're saying. So God tells Israel that He is separating them, from the people, from the rest. First Kings 8:53. First Kings 8:53, and that says, "For you separated." This is Solomon praying for the people, for to God. "For you separated them from among all the peoples of the earth to be your inheritance, as you spoke by your servant Moses when you brought our fathers out of Egypt, O Lord God." So again, here we found that God separated his people from the rest of the world. He put enmity between his people, Satan's seed, and Eve's seed. And what did God do so that man knew what sin was? Well, that's pretty easy. I think you guys know that. The Ten Commandments. Exodus 34:28. So he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the Ten Commandments. So God wrote on tablets of stone. Okay, that is not a coincidence. That is not a coincidence. Then Moses wrote another set of laws on a book. Okay, so it is very important that something that's written in stone. That's a phrase that we say, oh, that's written in stone. It means that it's supposed to last a very long time, forever in this case. So um, I think we're safe to say that at least in the Old Testament, God gave His people. He separated them. Okay, we already said He separated them, and then He gave them the Ten Commandments. Okay, but what happened? What happens if they sinned? What happens if they sinned? Leviticus 4, Leviticus chapter 4. 1 through 4. Excuse me. And just, kind of paraphrasing, I'm just going to read through it. It's like, "If a person sins unintentionally against any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which ought not to be done, and does any of them, if any anointed priest um, let him offer," and this is from verse 3, "let him offer to the Lord for his sin, which he has sinned, a young bull without blemish as a sin offering. He shall bring the bull to the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord, lay his hand on the bull's head, and kill the bull before the Lord." So a sacrifice was needed. So we have the description of sin, the Ten Commandments that was given to the people, And then we have now what it is that they have to do in order to for remission of sin, right? So they have to offer a sacrifice. In Hebrews 9:22, it says, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. Okay, that is, I think most people understand that. Okay, one law describes sin, the Ten Commandments, and one law is how to get rid of sin, how to get cleansed from sin. The Ten Commandments do not mention anything about sacrifice, anything about rituals or blood. We can keep the Ten Commandments without any rituals or without any sacrifices. That's a big difference between these two laws. Okay, but there's the other law, which we can call the ceremonial laws. That this is how in the Old Testament they got rid of sin through sacrifice of an animal. It's like basically the cleansing, how we get cleansed. It's almost like a prescription for sin. Sin is the the disease, and the sacrifice and the ceremonial laws were the prescription for sin. Leviticus 23:3 makes a distinction. Okay, there is a distinction between the weekly Sabbaths and the annual Sabbaths. But let's go ahead and just read it real quick. 23:3, and it says, 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. That reminds me of something that people say, that the Lord's Day is Sunday. There's nowhere in the Bible where it brings up Sunday as the Lord's Day. Yet we find that the Sabbath is called the Lord's Day. He calls it my Lord, the Sabbath of the Lord. So if God calls the Sabbath his day, who are we to say that any other day is God's day? Okay, that's just kind of a little aside. Leviticus 23, that same chapter, starting in verse 4, and it goes through each annual Sabbath. And we have the Passover, the first fruits, the trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the tabernacles. All the annual Sabbaths had a sacrifice that came along with it. So there was shedding of blood. The Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, the Sabbath of the Ten Commandments had nothing to do with sacrificing, with shedding blood. Anyone could keep the weekly Sabbath, just like anyone could keep the Ten Commandments. But what about the devil's seed? Okay, or the Gentiles? What about the Gentiles? Did they not have a say or a way of remission? And the answer is no. They couldn't do it. Something was blocking them. Remember, God separated Israel from the rest. Now are they allowed to participate in the ceremonial law or the cleansing of sin? Let's go to Exodus 12:43, chapter 12, verses 43 and 44. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat it. Okay, that sounds pretty sad, right? But there's a but. Every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat. And then verse 48, we're going to jump to verse 48. And when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as a native of the land, for no uncircumcised person shall eat it. So you had to become circumcised if you were a male and you wanted to participate of these ceremonial laws. If you wanted to participate of the remission of sin, at least in the Old Testament, this is what you had to do. Now it definitely sounds like a pretty sad thing. Like it seemed like unfair, right? But we can see later that God was actually very, merciful. And it wasn't meant because Israel was meant to be a light to the Gentiles, but they became just so full of, they thought that they were better. They became, they they went away from God's plan, and they started thinking like Satan. Well, I should be like God, right? That's what Satan was saying. Well, Israel, well, we are better than any Gentile, and they wanted to actually reject them. So there, that was a requirement. That's a pretty harsh requirement, right? The Israelites were already did that, and when the child was born, I believe it was on the eighth day, they got circumcised. Getting circumcised as an adult is a pretty harsh thing. There were two other requirements for the remission of sins. Leviticus 4:4, and then Deuteronomy 12. And we are getting close, so we may have to eventually cut it for the next next one. But Leviticus 4:4 says, "He shall bring the bull to the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord, lay his hand on the bull's head, and kill the bull before the Lord." So you had to bring it to the tabernacle, to what we would call the church today, the synagogue at that time. Deuteronomy 12, 12, 11, 13, and 14. So it says, "Then there will be the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide. There you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the heave offerings of your hand, and all your choice offerings which you vow to the Lord. Take heed to yourself that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every place that you see." So he says you cannot offer the sacrifices, the offerings, just anywhere. But, verse 14, "but in the place which the Lord chooses, in one of your tribes, where you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you." So you see how that enmity, how that separation made it, in some cases, people may say, almost impossible for the Gentile to go ahead and do, have that prescription of sin, that remission of sin, what they needed to do for the remission of sin. Israel was special in that aspect. Jehovah gives Israel 10 commandments. That's the description of sin, or how we know that we are sinners, how we know that we need Christ, how we need the blood of Christ. And Jehovah gives the ceremonial laws, the prescription or the remission of sin to his people. Now the Gentiles are cut off or separated, or actually it's reversed. The Israelites are separated from the Gentiles. They're given this special privilege, but doesn't mean that the Gentiles were not allowed to do it, but they had to be circumcised. They had to come to the temple and to the city where they had. So we have run out of time. I'm going to cut it here, and we are going to continue in the next next video. I hope you continue to pray and God bless you.